Welcome to Definitely Maybe Agile, the podcast where Peter Maddison and Dave Sharrock discuss the complexities of adopting new ways of working at scale. Hello, Dave. How are you today?
Peter, fantastic to catch up with you. It feels like it's been a while since we've really had a chance to have a sort of one-on-one discussion here, isn't it?
It does. And I think that you've had a lot of travel. I've had a lot of travel. And way again next week.
Conference season does that to us, right?
So it does. It does. Interesting conversations, though, meeting new people, all sorts of fun stuff. And it's speaking of which, as I understand it, we were just talking before this, you've been running some workshops at conferences recently.
Well, so I've certainly been to, 3 conferences in the last few weeks. And all of them stood out for different reasons in different ways. But when I was at the Global Scrum Gathering here in Vancouver, so it's Vancouver was the location for this global event this year. Very easy for me. I was able to kind of get out of my front door and just wander down to the conference. But I ran a workshop on how to use AI when you're in one of the non-technical roles, product manager, Scrum Master, Agile coach, those sorts of roles, and exactly how organizations are beginning, and people in their roles are beginning to change what they do.
It's interesting. And we're seeing that, I'm seeing that with my clients. So it's one of the topics of conversation is that, well, now everybody has access to these tools that allow them to create and generate. And in some cases, well, we're generating code and oh my, what could happen? But in particular, the sort of problems you were talking through solving, I thought were quite interesting. So why don't you tell our audience a little bit about
it? The intention was to sort of take an audience where they've been instructed, you can use AI. And this is what's happening in lots of organizations. We've made Copilot available. We've made this available and that available. Change what you're doing and use AI. And what we see in many organizations is that for the individual, it's often a freezing point. They're kind of caught with they're in the headlight, but they freeze instead of knowing where to go. So the intention of the workshop is to take that and just gently guide them to the point where they're beginning to use prompts in a way that is more constructive for the work, the particular roles that they were doing. So the workshop itself ended up introducing some of these ideas, and then through application within the workshop, people were jumping on their phones and actually creating prompts, trying them out. So, it's sort of a low level, how would we do this if we're right out of the door? And then we built a bit of structure in it, and they tried again, and we built a bit more structure, and they tried again, and they could see the progression of how those different structures for the prompts added value to what was going on.
Which sometimes, especially coming from the technical side, we take this for granted because we're used to thinking like that. And from an agile space, we're used to thinking like that. Get fast feedback, feed it back into the system. Like, who'd have thought?
Well, it's what we found was really interesting is, first of all, yes, to get fast feedback and feed it back in. And we're dealing, a lot of the people in the room would be Scrum Masters, product owners, Agile coaches, team members. This is not a group that doesn't know about iterative feedback loops and learning as you go. But one of the things that we find very quickly is that they don't really have a good appreciation for what they can change. They just get feedback that it worked well enough. So the actual recognition that a little bit of structure, a little bit of knowledge, so we're trying to give that information, that knowledge as we're going through. And that generated a whole range of great conversations in the room. People you could almost see the light bulbs going off in their heads as they're realizing that just making small changes, like adding context, like the direct context to a prompt, or creating some outline of what the outcome should be, what the output should look like, all of a sudden tightens up the response that they're getting as they went through. So that journey, if you like, of iterating and learning in many organizations, or many cases that we were bumping into and that were in the audience, is the iteration is happening, but because they don't know what the next thing to do, learn and try differently is, they're not necessarily picking up on what that can be. So just as an example, one of the takeaways that kind of like rocked people back a little bit in some of the conversations was simply the idea of going back to an LLM and saying, help me improve this prompt. Which sounds so simple because we're all doing this like routinely, or throwing it into different LLMs to kind of fine tune and navigate to this sort of ideal piece. But that's because we've been exposed to it and we're doing it over and over again. And that's not something that everybody understands right at the outset.
Yeah, and I think there's a really important part of that It's that you're enabling a lot more people to get their hands on using these tools to create value within the organization, which in turn feeds into the rest of the system. I mean, it's as we start to think about what is the nature of how people interact with these tools, what they can do with them, how they can build them. I mean, I've built quite a few of these systems now where I would do the kind of things you're describing with things like LangGraph and stuff like this, and just start to feed them together or put them into, because I like to experiment with the different development toolkits to think about how do these agents then work together to create various outcomes. And I think it's a really great way that you're describing of helping less technical people understand the sort of how do you do this? How do you actually sort of take an idea and iterate on it? How do you help these systems learn what it is that you're looking for and get better results out of them? Because I've also run into plenty of people who said, yeah, I tried this and it didn't work. Including on the development side, that people are like, I tried AI, it doesn't work, it's terrible. They're like, I don't know why everyone's blabbing out. It's all just hype because all I get out is crap.
Well, and we've got to remember, in many cases, they're overloaded. They've got a backlog of work to do. They're being told, use AI, you can get more done. But they have their blinkers on because of the stress and the amount of work coming in. And that just removes your creativity, your exploration, your ability to kind of explore a little bit and experiment gets taken away very, very quickly under those circumstances. So again, that breakdown and it comes back to that scaffolding of learning. How do we create an environment where people can just see a little bit further down the road, build on top of that, and then use that to see a little further again down the road and just gently move forward? And that was really the goal of, as we went through the conversations. What I found fascinating walking around the groups as they're doing these experiments is there were definitely people who they already knew how to do this for sure. The room had plenty of that sort of experienced individuals there, but having the conversation between the experienced individuals who could confidently say, this is some of the things we've experienced or what you're seeing there, or try this with different LLMs, which one of the key things that came out. But then there are other people who are literally, you could see them going, oh, I get so much more out of this. And you can see them sort of mentally making the note of, this is going to really help me actually in your personal life, because we all use these things all the time personally as well as at work, but really just kind of getting a feel for exactly how far the door can be pushed open and how much more can be achieved.
I think there's a really valuable nugget in there from what you're describing, which is when we interact as humans and we have these conversations, we create those learning moments. We know this, like we've been teaching for a long time. So if we're looking at building learning organizations, if we're looking at building organizations that can develop and expand and take these ideas, having people, it can actually be very valuable to have people who don't understand this so that you can talk to them and figure out, because they're going to try and solve the problem in a way that you've never thought of.
Absolutely. And they ask the craziest questions because they don't have context. So all of a sudden they're not nervous about asking questions if we give them the right platform for it. So there was a lot of fun with that. And I think one of the things that we saved until the end, which was one of the moments that had a really interesting conversation, is, again, for those of us who've been doing this a lot, we understand the idea of nesting agents, having one agent create some output and maybe modify or not modify it and just feed it straight into the next agent. But that whole concept of orchestration. And so the way we sort of wrapped up the workshop is an explanation of how the workshop itself was created. We've been running this workshop now for probably well over a year at this point. And the reality is how we prompt LLMs, the thinking behind that is changing all the time. So one of the things that we did is we actually created a group of agents that build the workshop itself by looking at the latest thinking and evaluating, are we still relevant with the content that we have? Do we need to modify it? Do we need to change the examples and so on? So we had this sort of linear slew of agents basically rebuilding the workshop based on current thinking.
Which I love that. I mean, I've used it for a variety of different purposes to build things out in that way. And I think I was suggesting to you earlier that your next challenge is to have that run on autopilot and generate the workshop, and then just walk in blind and run it. See what comes up.
I love the way you put me on the spot to do that. But absolutely, I mean, this is really interesting, because those nuances about, do I really trust it to be able to walk into, let's say, a major decision committee meeting of some sort and just pull something up that my agents have created ready for that with sight unseen? I'm probably not going to do that just yet, but we're learning as we go.
Yeah, I would want some, depending on the level you're having that conversation, I think I'd want some very strict rules around
apparently
using that for. The sort of, I was thinking in terms of your conference presentation.
Yes, yeah. Well, I mean, the same as any presentation, right? As you're looking at that. And I think as we just talk a little bit about that, one of the interesting things is the way that we're evaluating quality as we go forward. So that quality isn't just this case of how do I build up a presentation with section by section and slide by slide, but it's actually, as we're doing that, how are we validating that the content we're using is meeting our expectations around target audience, intent for the workshop, all of these things. Or when you build a landing page or you build a PowerPoint, how does that meet the expectations around design, around, even speaking notes and things like that go into all of this? How are they created in such a way that we're controlling, we're managing that against an expectation of quality?
There's two pieces I think I've built into all of the systems I've been building. One of them is a dummy LLM, whose responsibility is just to allow me to functionally test the system without there actually being an LLM there and burning through tokens for no reason. And the other is a test harness that has got an LLM built into it that validates the logic. I mean, you always find yourself, at least I found in every one of these systems, I've got to a point where the only realistic way to move forward at any kind of speed is to build something that is going to do that non-deterministic testing of the system for me, so I can validate that I'm getting the outputs I'm expecting. And because I'm dealing with a non-deterministic system, it's painful to click through that every time and see if I'm getting what I need. So I want to build a persona of the customer, create the persona, and have it interact with the system and see what happens as an outcome from that, and then have the evaluation occur of that. So I have a presentation builder that it evaluates it to say, does it meet these criteria? Is it on topic from the research? Is the modifications to it on topic? Does it fit within the slides in the way that it should, etc.? And it does that judgment. So you're going through and judging the content, and then using that as running that through. And of course, you can then parallelize that if you start to see where am I getting to with different types of personas, all sorts of fun things.
Well, and I really like the one of the consequences that comes out of it is moving away from a linear optimization model of what are the steps that I go through in creating this deck, this doc, whatever it might be that we're creating, into more of a team-based. What are the roles that you want to have involved? Because it's no longer this linear path of like a payment shopping cart experience where I'm going to enter that path and just flow through to the end. It's much more a case of what are the different roles and how do they interact with the artifact that we're building in such a way that we're validating these very different needs from very different perspectives.
Yep, exactly. So if we're going to wrap this up for our audience, and so they can rush away and sign up for your workshop, and then how would you wrap this up? What sort of 3 points would you like our audience to take away with?
I don't know. I'll come up with two and I'll let you come up with a third, perhaps. Let's see. So one of them is the value of actually trying things out with context rather than just generic. The tendency we often see is we're given generic examples and we can go and create generic prompts or generic exercises. The reality is I have a very specific role. I need guidance and context, like relevant to that role. So that was one of the things that we very quickly see, that if I'm a product manager, I have very specific product management needs, and I don't need generic prompts to try and help me understand that. I need very specific, contextually relevant examples to work with. That would be the first one. And then I think the second one is that whole agents as a team of how to create something and rethinking how we look at that and experimenting with multiple agents pulling things together, and exactly what you mentioned, that sort of quality control, persona-driven perspectives of evaluating what gets built. Because I think there's a lot of room for exploration there, and that really changes how we think about what it is that we're doing and what we're building. It stops being a build this using AI into how do we manage this in a way that brings quality to the fore.
I think if I'm going to add a third one, I think the little nugget there of the human piece of it is that, and I think actually the underlying theme there is don't assume that everybody gets this. I mean, this is something we already see and know. I mean, and we're bombarded with it. If you're anywhere close to the vicinity of this topic, everybody's seen it. But don't assume that everybody understands it or knows it or can see how to apply it to particular problems. That is very much less understood, and so I think there's a piece there of getting people who do understand it and people who don't understand it in a room together and helping them think through this will help everybody learn, which I think is important. Awesome. So with that, I think I'll wrap it up there. So thank you, Dave, as always. And anybody who wants to reach out, they can at feedback@definitelymaybeagile.com. We have a couple of guests coming up over the next few weeks, and we're always welcome new ones. So thanks as always. Until next time.
Until next time. Thanks again for the chat.
Yeah, and don't forget to subscribe. I've got to remember. You've been listening to Definitely Maybe Agile, the podcast where your hosts, Peter Maddison and David Sharrock, focus on the art and science of digital, agile, and DevOps at scale.